All right, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Um, so thank you for joining on what for many of us is a busy evening. Um, the topic is Israel and American Jewish identity, and I want to preface what I have to say um, by saying that in a certain way this class has started in a lot of different ways. It's an outgrowth of a lot of different things, but it's in some ways also an outgrowth of the kiddish conversations that I used to do. Remember, once upon a time we had services in the building, and we ate tuna and bagels afterwards, and once a month or so I would present a topic, and what I liked about doing those kiddish conversations was that it allowed me to speak about controversial stuff in a way where there was enough time to address it adequately, where people could ask questions, where people could present their own perspective, where people could disagree with me. And I wasn't speaking, ex cathedra, right? I mean, when you're giving a sermon, it's sort of like, thus saith the Lord, right? And this isn't thus saith the Lord. This is thus saith Charles, right? And so I like the ability to not have to self censor and to talk about difficult stuff, but in a situation where we can really talk about it, and nobody's looking to score points. So that's kind of the preface to this whole thing. And quite honestly, although I'm recording it, I don't know whether I'm going to put it up on YouTube or not. Right? It depends on what we say and how, particularly how I feel about what I say, and whether it might be misunderstood. Okay, so I want to start by giving a little bit of a historical overview. Okay, because one of the things that I've tried to do in teaching and sermons is remind us that Judaism has a history, and that things were not always as they are today, right? That there are certain myths that we live by, certain myths that all of our grandparents and great grandparents were very, 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 very observant. Okay, which, if you study the history of American Jewry, is not true. Okay, your grandparents were far more likely to have been socialists or communists than to have been Orthodox. Um, because if they were Orthodox, they probably would have stayed in Europe rather than come to this country. Um, and similarly, the idea that the American Jewish community was always Zionist and always pro-Israel is wrong. Okay, and some of you are old enough to remember some of the things that I'm only talking about. In fact, looking at who's here, tonight I am the youngest person. It's not always the case, but tonight I am the youngest person. Um, so all of you remember more than I do. But I actually, the rabbinical school where I went, in order to be ordained, you had to write a thesis, okay, which is something more than a master's thesis, but less than a PhD dissertation. But it was a serious piece of work. And I wrote my thesis on the history of the North American branch of Hashomer Hatzair. Hashomer Hatzair is a Zionist youth movement that existed. It actually was founded right after World War One, in Poland and Germany, and it existed and still exists all over the world. But I wrote about the North American branch. But in order to fully understand that context, I had to really do a lot of research into the history of American Zionism, in general. Um, and I'm proud to say that although my thesis was never published, it is the standard work on this topic, and it has been referred to in footnotes, different books and articles, and so on and so forth. So the history of American Zionism is something that I actually know something about. It doesn't mean I'm always right, but I'm not just talking out of my hat either. I know something about the history. Okay, and um, the fact of the matter is that up until 1942, most American Jews were not Zionists. And most American Jews were not Zionists. In 1942, there was a conference held at the Biltmore Hotel in New York where they adopted the Biltmore platform. And two things happened of significance at that conference. The first was this was a conference actually of the world Zionist movement. And it wasn't until 1942 that the Zionist movement officially said the aim of Zionism is the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, not just a Jewish settlement, homeland, whatever, but a Jewish state. And the American Jewish organizations that were not officially Zionists but were observers at the Biltmore Conference adopted a position of officially supporting Zionism. Okay, now why 1942? Okay, what was going on in the world in 1942, right? And it became clear, I think, to most people that the creation of a Jewish state was a necessity, right? I mean that this was before the Holocaust, although the camps were already in operation. But people understood that there were going to be lots of Jewish refugees. They needed a place to go. The United States had been mostly closed to Jews fleeing Europe. I mean, some got in, but most did not manage to get in. And so the turn to Zionism was as much pragmatic as it was ideological. Okay, but if you look at the history of the different religious movements in American Judaism, Reform Judaism was officially anti-Zionist until 1937. Okay, I mean, doesn't mean that there were not Reform Jews who were Zionists. There were. I mean, Stephen Wise, Abba Hillel Silver, but as a movement, Reform Judaism was anti-Zionist until 1937, when they passed a new platform that called on all Jews to aid in the upbuilding of Palestine as a center of Jewish culture and a refuge for our oppressed brethren. Okay, so from the perspective of a Zionist, that's not really a Zionist. It's pro-Zionist, right? It's pro-Zionist. We support Israel for practical, necessary reasons, but our support of Israel is essentially charitable and political. Okay, it's charitable and political. And Orthodox Judaism was also mostly anti-Zionist until really also the 30s, although, many Orthodox Jews are still anti-Zionist. I mean, particularly ultra-Orthodox. I mean, when I mean ultra-Orthodox Jews. I remember one time, for example, when I lived in Baltimore, I was a member of both a conservative and an Orthodox shul. And I was at the Orthodox shul that I belonged to one Shabbat morning, and the Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael Yeshiva, his grandson was bar mitzvah. And this shul, now you may not think that this is a big deal, but within Orthodoxy, it is a big deal. do you say the prayer for the state of Israel during services or not? Okay, and this shul does. Okay, well, the Rosh Hashiva, when they got to the prayer for the state of Israel and everybody was standing, he demonstratively sat down. Okay, and everybody noticed it. I mean, you could hear an audible hum. Okay, and what's interesting is that this guy had lived most of his life in Israel. He grew up in Baltimore, but he moved to Israel to learn in a yeshiva. And then he became a Rosh Yeshiva, and then he came back to Baltimore to head Neris role after the previous Rosh Yeshiva died. So he had no problem living in Israel for 50, 60 years. But to say the prayer for the state of Israel, under no circumstances would he countenance that prayer. I mean, it's an unusual, and I don't want to get too bogged down, but this is a big line within the sort of the black hat Orthodox world. Now, when I spoke about supporting Israel as a cultural center and a refuge for oppressed Jews, American Zionism was unique in that in the rest of the world, to be a Zionist meant promoting and preparing for Aliyah. Right? If you were a Zionist, you wanted to live in Israel. Okay? American Zionism was not about Aliyah. It was basically about helping Jews in other countries who wanted to make Aliyah. It was about helping Jews in the land of Israel and giving them charitable and subsequently also political support. But it was not about making Aliyah. Hashomer Tzair, about which I wrote my thesis, was the one exception. That was really the one exception. And if you know the history, like there are certain kibbutzim in Israel that were founded before 1948 by Americans. Ein HaShofet, there are some others. They were all founded by Americans from Hashomer Tzair. Hashomer Tzair actually had a farm in Hightstown, New Jersey, where after you graduated high school, you went there and you learned all the skills that would be necessary to live on a kibbutz. And if you didn't make Aliyah, you were drummed out of the movement. Okay, but Hashomer Tzair was the unique exception to the general sense that that Zionism was really about supporting Israel, but not about making Aliyah oneself. Okay, and this continued until the establishment of the state of Israel. I mean, as I said, so in 1950, there was a meeting between David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, of course, and a man by the name of Jacob Blaustein. Jacob Blaustein was a wealthy Baltimore industrialist who was the head. Alan, you're shaking your head. You may even have known him or knew who he was. He was at the time the head of the American Jewish Committee. Okay, and the American Jewish Committee, up until that point, was officially non-Zionist. Okay, now, again, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, right? But the American Jewish Committee was founded by German Jews, okay, as a response to the Bayless trial in the early 1900s in Russia and the Leo Frank lynching in Atlanta, also in the early 1900s. And it was wealthy, mostly assimilated American Jews, but American Jews of German ancestry, okay, as opposed to the American Jewish Congress, which was American Jews of Eastern European ancestry. Okay, and there are certain things about that cultural split that to this day still exists. I mean, the American Jewish Committee, I'm a big fan of the American Jewish Committee, as a matter of fact, and I have gone to um, its global forum several times over the last few years. And the first time that I went, it was a real culture shock. Because, if you go to a Jewish meeting and it says plenary starts at 10:30, when does it start?
11 o'clock.
10:45, 11 o'clock, right? American Jewish Committee plenaries, if they're called for 10:30, they start at 10:30. If they're supposed to run from 10:30 to 11:45, they run from 10:30 to 11:45. Okay, and I happen to love this, but it was also a huge culture shock because I'd never seen anything like that in any other, Jewish organizational context. But anyway, so in 1950, Blaustein and Ben Gurion met in Jerusalem, and they came to the following agreement. Okay, American Jews would fundraise and lobby for Israel, and they would refrain from interfering in its internal affairs. Conversely, Israel would recognize that the political loyalty of American Jews is to the United States. Israel would not urge mass aliyah from the United States, although if individual Jews wanted to make aliyah, that was fine, but it would not be the policy of Israel to encourage mass aliyah from the United States. It would not be the policy of the government of Israel to refer to American Jews as being in exile, and they would not interfere in the internal affairs of American Jewry. Okay, so recognition, I guess, of two equally important power centers that were supportive of each other but independent of each other, and would not interfere in the internal affairs of either. I'm going to pause here if there are any questions or comments on what I've said so far. Anyone? Yeah, Alan.
Yeah. Rabbi, you said that there was this conference in 1942. Who was at the conference? What was the makeup of that conference?
It was a meeting of the World Jewish Congress. I'm sorry, the World Zionist Congress. Okay, because the United States was the only place that they could safely meet. Right? They couldn't meet in Israel, which was at war. We were at war too, but the war wasn't being fought here. Right? They couldn't meet in Europe and they couldn't meet in Israel. So they met here. So it was really, for the most part, this is something that unless you are really into either Zionist history or the current workings of the World Zionist Organization, you may not realize that all of the different Zionist organizations are essentially aligned with Israeli political parties. And they in many senses, they predate. Like if you've heard of like the Labor Zionist Alliance, right, which is aligned with the Labor Party, and all of these is what are now Israeli parties have affiliates throughout the world. Okay, and so it was mostly the American affiliates of these worldwide organizations that were meeting at the Biltmore Conference. Okay, but they were fully delegated to speak on behalf of the world, of their world bodies, right? But there are, all different, like the labor Zionists and the revisionist Zionists, which is today's Likud, I, I mean, the revisionists and the religious Zionists, and you know, all the different parties under the umbrella of of Zionists, and this continues today. I mean, you know, there were about a year ago elections to the World Zionist Congress, right? And you know, it's different now because the reform movement has its own list and the conservative movement has its own list, but all of these different Israeli political parties also have their list here. I didn't publicize it because I didn't think it was right to use the resources of the Senate. I was actually a Labor Party candidate for the World Zionist Congress. I was fairly low down on the list. I did not get elected. I did not expect to get elected, but I was a candidate running on the Labor Party's list of, you know, for the American elections to the World Zionist Congress. Um, so anyway, so you know, 1948 and then 1956 were really kind of turning points. 1956 specifically, because you know, here, I mean, it was an interesting situation. The 56, the Suez War, the war between Israel and Egypt, because Israel was France and the UK were on the side of Israel. The United States was really on the side of Egypt. Um, and so, you know, you've probably heard of an organization called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, right? Known as the President's Conference. And why does the President's Conference exist, and when was it founded? It was founded in 1956. Okay, and essentially the real founder of the President's Conference was a man by the name of Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, how did this happen? Because we know this, we have all of these different Jewish organizations in the United States, right? Each one claims to speak for American Jewry, right? And each one is going to the White House and saying, we need to have a meeting with the president, or if not the president, the Secretary of State, so that we can present the perspective of the American Jewish community on this crucial issue. And Eisenhower finally said to the Jews, you guys get your stuff together, okay? I am not having 40 meetings with 40 different organizations on each issue. Every time there's a crisis in the Middle East, I don't have to have 40 meetings with 40 different organizations. You guys figure it out, okay? And I want to speak to one organization, right? And so the President's Conference was founded, you know, and similarly, I mean, just as an aside, there's also an organization called IJKIC. Okay, IJKIC is the International Jewish Commission Conference, something on interreligious consultations. Okay, why does IJKIC exist? Because in the 1960s, when there started to be rapprochement between Jews and the Vatican said the same thing, right? We don't want to have, the Pope does not want to meet with the head of the Reform movement, the head of the conservative movement, the head of the Orthodox, the head of the ultra Orthodox, the head of the Reconstructionists, the head of the Labor Zionists, the head of, you guys figure it out. Okay, so each kick was created as the vehicle of dialogue with the Vatican, so that the Vatican didn't have to meet individually with, you know, 100 different, you know, 100 different chief rabbis of the world, right? And it is often sort of external pressure that will cause us to be, you know, more well organized and united than we otherwise would be. Okay, so 1956, the Suez Crisis. But I would maintain that Israel, and here, I'm not talking about things that I actually remember, but we're starting to get into the era that I actually remember. But I would say that Israel did not become central to American Jewish identity until 1967 or so, with the Six-Day War. And I mean, I think one of the things that you can sort of chart that is the shift in Hebrew pronunciation, right? I mean, how many of you were taught Hebrew using an Ashkenazi pronunciation, right? Most of you, okay? And how many were taught Hebrew using an Israeli pronunciation? Me, right? The youngest, right? And this is, but I think that this shift, and by the way, I say Israeli pronunciation and not Sephardi pronunciation, because it's not Sephardic. I mean, the Israeli pronunciation is not Sephardic. I mean, it's one of my professors in rabbinical school called it Ashkephardic, right? which is really what it is in many ways. It's kind of Ashkephardic, but standard Israeli Hebrew. But look, I do not believe that there is a conservative or reform or reconstructionist synagogue in the United States that does not teach its kids Israeli pronunciation of Hebrew, right? That is the standard normative pronunciation. And that is a clear, I mean, there are a lot of reasons for it. One of them is, of course, identification with Israel, and the idea that, well, our kids might go to Israel and then they'll be able to speak Hebrew, which is nuts. I mean, we're very happy if at the end of, their Hebrew school career, they can actually read Hebrew, let alone, speak it. But day school kids can certainly speak Hebrew, and they also learn, Israeli Hebrew, but it's also Israeli teachers in our schools, right? So that the Israeli pronunciation is important, not only ideologically, but also pragmatically, right? But so the use of Israeli pronunciation, Israeli flags on the bima, right? Again, I mean, I don't know. I mean, was there an Israeli flag on the bima of the shul when you were growing up?
Of course not.
Yes,
Who said yes?
I did.
Okay. What shul did you grow up?
How many? I would say the last one was Temple Israel in Silver Spring. But that was in the 60s.
In the 60s. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think, before 67, that would have been unusual, right? That would have been unusual. I think what led to that shift was obviously the Six-Day War, right? In two ways. One, the real fear prior to the war that Israel would be annihilated, right? And I think many American Jews found themselves surprised at how much that meant to them, right? I mean, you don't realize how important something is to you until it's in danger of disappearing, right? And the in point of fact, I mean, and I know this for a fact because people spoke, there were people who had left Kehillat Shalom who joined again at around the same time that I came here because they figured Kehillat Shalom would always be there. And then when it might not, I really need to step up and support it again. And so I think American Jews were surprised at how emotionally connected to Israel they turned out to be. And then after the war, tremendous pride in the Israeli achievement, right? But I think it's not only that. I mean, I think that, the Black pride also was a stimulus to Jewish pride. I mean, I remember, talking to people, I mean, not only older than me, but well older than me, but if you went to an Orthodox day school prior to the late 1960s, you were taught that a kippah was an indoor garment, right? It was extremely rare for people to wear, even Orthodox Jews, for people to wear kippot in public, right? I mean, I remember, I grew up in Brooklyn, and we had neighbors and close friends who lived in the apartment across the hall from us who were modern Orthodox, right? And they were strictly Shabbat observant, strictly kosher. The husband in that family did not wear a kippah to work. It just wasn't done. And, because the goal was to fit in, right? But if African Americans could wear dashikis, and natural hairstyles, Jews could wear kippot, right? And so ethnic pride and became more acceptable. Multiculturalism. I mean, I think in many ways the sort of guiding myth of American society went from melting pot to mosaic, right? That you could be American and still maintain your own culture, right? And you didn't have to give that up in order to be part of the American, as I say, mosaic, right? I think also, 1967 is only 22 years after the Holocaust. And I think, it takes people a while. And I think it was not until the 1960s that people started grappling with the Holocaust and what had happened and what that meant. And also, the Soviet Jewry movement, which after all was about allowing Soviet Jews to move to Israel, at least initially, right? So all of those things, I think, combine to create a much stronger sense of the importance and the centrality and identification of American Jews with Israel. Okay, and so some of the things that point to that shift, as I said, Israeli pronunciation of Hebrew, Israeli flags on the bima, Israeli counselors in American Jewish summer camp, Israeli teachers in American day schools and in Hebrew schools. Year in Israel programs became much more popular. I mean, they had existed beforehand, but they weren't huge, right? Whereas by the time, I spent my junior year of college at the Hebrew University, okay? And there were hundreds of people on my program, and that continues. Also, at the same time, gap year programs where people spent a year, they took a year between high school and college to spend in Israel. And that had, again, always existed, but they became much more popular, right? So, in the Orthodox community, that's the norm, right? That is absolutely the norm, right? It is just, it is automatic. I mean, Stan, you have family who live in that community, right? It is automatic, right?
They're going.
Right. You graduate high school, you spend a year or 2 years in Israel, before you start college. That's the question is not if, the question is not when, the question is where, right? Which program are you going to go to, right? But it is absolutely, an automatic assumption that everybody's going to spend a year or 2 years in Israel between high school and college. What also happened starting in the late 60s, early 70s is that most rabbinical schools started requiring a year in Israel, right? Which, I mean, is a sea change, right? I mean, virtually every rabbi in the United States has spent at least 1 year living in Israel, right? Which, and most more. I mean, I spent a total of 4 years of my life in Israel, right? But it means, I have lots of Israeli friends, very familiar, with Israeli culture, Israeli pop music, Israeli poetry, Israeli literature. I mean, for those of you who are fans, the third year of Shtisel started streaming on Netflix today, and we sit and we watch Shtisel, and Kelly is kind of saying, shut up, okay? I know you know where that is, right? You don't have to tell me every time you see it, oh, I know exactly where that is, right? But it's very familiar. And so, and there is this sort of cross-fertilization between Israel and the American Jewish community that didn't exist before, the late 60s, early 70s. And, and such things like, I mean, every kosher deli has falafel on the menu, right? I mean, I guarantee you that, Bubby and Zadie in Russia or Lithuania or Romania had no idea what falafel was, right? I mean, indeed, there are falafel wars on American college campuses where, Arab students get mad at Jewish students for claiming falafel as an Israeli food when it's really a Palestinian food, or Syrian or Iraqi or whatever. But it is indigenous to the Middle East. It is not indigenous to Europe, right? But the falafelization of American society, the fact, of American Jewish society, is also it is a cross fertilization between the United States and Israel. Okay, so that has really, I think changed. Okay, again, I'll stop for questions or comments if there are any. Yeah, Sue.
I just wonder if you have ever heard of the youth organization Habonim, Labor
Yeah.
Zionist Youth, because when I grew up in the district in junior high school, I don't remember how I got into it, but somehow I joined. And it was, to me, probably one of the most inspiring parts of growing up. I learned, I think, all the Israeli songs. It was the first time I had ever seen a Havdalah ceremony. And I feel like it really helped my connection, not only to Israel, but to Judaism also.
Right, yeah. I mean, Habonim, yes, absolutely. I mean, there are a number of different Zionist youth movements, all of which are worldwide, that still function in the United States, but they're small. All right, Habonim and Hashomer Tzair are the two sort of labor oriented, right? I mean, Habonim is is connected to the Labor Party in Israel. Hashem Eretz Yair is more left wing. They were connected to a party that was once known as Mapam, which today known as Meretz. Okay, but these are the two. I mean, the elections 2 days ago, right? But the two main left-wing Zionist parties are Labor and Meretz, and both of them grew. I mean, as much as the electorate went right, the left-wing Zionist parties also grew significantly in the most recent election. So there's Habonim, which is part of the Labor Party, which is affiliated to the Labor Party, Hashem Eretz Yair, which is affiliated to Meretz, Young Judea, which is also very, Young Judea is probably the largest movement, and it is independent. It's not connected to any particular Israeli political party. And there's also Bnei Akiva, which is the Orthodox, which is connected to the National Religious Party. But these movements still certainly exist, and they aren't that large. I mean, but for the people who participate in them, and we've had a number of kids from our congregation in Young Judea, and they still are very, very significant and very, very meaningful, and really can shape a very strong and positive Jewish identity and affiliation with Israel for life. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now I want to skip ahead a little bit to 1990, okay, because 1990 was very significant in American Judaism, because in 1990 there was issued the NJPS, the National Jewish Population Study. Okay, there had not been a demographic study of the American Jewish community in many, many years, and one was done in 1990, and the key bullet point from that study was a 52% intermarriage rate, okay, which scared the you-know-what out of the organized Jewish community, okay? Oh my God, 52% intermarriage. Now, I want to tell you that 52% figure was quite quickly debunked, because it's a bogus figure, because it counted anybody with one Jewish parent as a Jew for purposes of this figure. So, like, for example, right, I have two nieces, right, with a Jewish father, a Catholic mother, who have been raised as and are active Unitarians. Okay, my nieces, who I love dearly and are wonderful people, they are not halachically Jewish. They are not religiously Jewish. They were not raised as Jews. They were raised as Unitarians. They are not Jewish by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, should my nieces marry somebody who is not Jewish, right, the 1990 population study would have counted that as an intermarriage. Okay, which is absurd, right? In no way is that an intermarriage, right? That is a Gentile marrying another Gentile can't possibly be. I mean, it could be an intermarriage between, a Unitarian and a Jew, but whatever, but that's not, right? They are not Jews, and therefore they cannot be part of that 52% intermarriage rate, but they were. Okay, now, the positive result of that was that it led to a tremendous increase of funding for Hillel and other campus programming. Okay, now I was working for Hillel at the time. Okay, and that sort of coincided with the fact that B'nai B'rith, which had been the sponsor of Hillel, was kind of collapsing. So it was a good time for Hillel to become independent of B'nai B'rith. But in 1990, the total budget of Hillel, meaning not just like the Hillel headquarters in Washington, but all the Hillels in the countries together, was something like $16 million. Okay, and 4 years later, it had quadrupled. Okay, and I'm sure now it's up to hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, the other big thing that grew out of the 1990 NJPS was the founding of Birthright, right? Because people were looking for a sort of magic bullet, or an inoculation, if you will, right? And it was felt that Israel was the magic bullet to preserve Jewish identity. Okay, now, did Birthright do that? I don't know, right? I mean, there have been endless studies of the impact of Birthright. I would say that I think it is fair to say that Birthright has an impact on people, but unless there is continued programmatic follow-up, it's like you got your first vaccine, but you didn't get your booster, right? And let me let you in on a secret. We're probably going to require boosters every year, right? And if we don't get the boosters, the vaccine is gonna wear off after a while. But it also had a negative effect because teen programs were devastated by Birthright, right? Because people were saying, well, why should I spend thousands of dollars to send my kid, when they're 16, when they can wait a couple of years and go for free, right? And the difference is that a 10-day program versus a 5 or 6 week summer program, to my mind, there's no comparison. I mean, I'm talking as somebody who went on such a program when I was 15 and who staffed 2 such programs years later. And I think that these programs have a much more significant, if only because they're longer term and have more educational content than a 10-day Birthright does. But it is certainly increased the percentage of American Jews who've at least been to Israel at some point in their life. But at the same time, as Birthright was coming on the scene and Hillel was being strengthened, other things were happening in the American Jewish community. Okay. And, really, I think starting with the second Intifada in 2000, right? Where, I mean, so in 1993, 94, there were the Oslo Accords, right? And there was tremendous optimism, and people really, I think, really felt that that peace was around the corner. And then, Rabin was assassinated, and then the second Intifada in 2000, and that sort of just blew up the whole Oslo process, right? And and so, much less optimism, but I think also much less sort of consensus in the American Jewish community about the justice of Israeli policy, right? I mean, and if you chart this, right? I mean, the two-state solution, everybody knows what I mean when I say two-state solution, right? That the state of Israel living alongside an independent Palestinian state, right? The two from 1967 to 1993, the two-state solution was heresy in the American Jewish community, right? And if you supported the two-state solution, you could be ostracized. You could lose your job if you worked for an American Jewish organization. In 1993, the two-state solution went from heresy to orthodoxy, right? That's proving, by the way, I think that the difference between heresy and orthodoxy is a matter of time. But in 1993, the two-state solution became orthodoxy, and it is still, the official sort of orthodoxy of most American Jewish organizations, right? But as time goes on, I think the likelihood of the two-state solution ever being put into practice grows slimmer and slimmer, right? And I mean, I think that is, objectively the case, right? And so if you look at, I would say contemporary challenges to the relationship of Israel and American Jews, right? I mean, there are a few sources of tension. One is the whole question of religious pluralism and the law of return and so on and so forth, right? Which I have to say, I mean, and you were all part of the Who is a Jew class. I think for that particular issue, American Jewish organizations have acted to some extent in an irresponsible way, right? Because you hear all the time, oh, they don't think we're Jews. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's not true. And even if you yourself are a convert or you have converts in your family, Israel does recognize those conversions, or children and grandchildren of those people who have converted as Jews for the purposes of citizenship, making aliyah, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, for purposes of marriage, that's a different issue, and it affects Israelis as much as it affects diaspora Jews. But it is simply not true that Israel doesn't think that we're Jews. It's just not true, and yet many rabbis preach that line. Having said that, there are clearly issues around religious pluralism in Israel, and people encounter that, if they want to have, if their kid wants to have a bar or bat mitzvah in Israel, right? It becomes almost impossible to have the kind of service that we have here, unless you want to go, somewhere, way off the beaten track. So there are issues around, religious pluralism that I think, contribute to tension between Israel and American Jewry, right? And it certainly doesn't help, when Israeli Orthodox rabbis issue statements, comparing non-Orthodox Jews to dogs and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so there's tension there. I think there's also, to a certain extent, some degree of Israel fatigue, right? I mean, on Tuesday, right, were the fourth elections in less than 2 years, right? And I have to say that every election, I am less and less interested.
Mhm.
Right? It's simply a fact. I mean, I follow the election campaigns less. I follow the election results less, and particularly when they are so inconclusive, right? And you know, by the way, I mean, I know that there are degrees of, you know, how much attention people pay to these things, but the final results were issued earlier today. Um, and one thing is quite clear: there's going to be a fifth round, right?
Mhm.
Because neither BB side nor the anti-BB side can put together a government, right? Because you have, you know, the only way for Netanyahu to put together a government is to include this Islamist party that got 5 seats, right? And they are very smart. They are very smart. They are playing the same game that the Haredim are playing, which is to say, we don't care about any issues. Deliver the goods for our community, and you have our support, right? And so the Islamist party, which got 5 seats, is saying to Netanyahu, absolutely, we will happily sit in a government with you, right? Give us more money for our school system, give us more money for our health system, give us better policing in our cities, crack down on crime and drugs and guns, and we will support you, right? But, you know, Netanyahu is a moderate compared to some of the other parties, right? And these other parties, so he needs the Islamists and he needs the Kahanists, right? And I'm not exaggerating. There's a Kahanist party which also has about 5 seats, right? And the Islamists and the Kahanists cannot really sit together in the same government, right? So, you know, that's out the window, right? On the other hand, there's the other Arab party, the Joint List, which has 7 seats, right? Which again, they will sit, right? But you have like Lieberman's party, right? You have two parties, Lieberman's party and Bennett's party, which have identical policy as Netanyahu, but they're essentially the equivalent of never Trump Republicans, right? They agree with Netanyahu on policy 100%. They think Netanyahu is a corrupt megalomaniac, and they will not sit with him. But can they sit with the Islamists? I mean, you know, so well, can the Islamists sit with that? So, you know, I mean, unless, which is not impossible, right? But unless you get sort of significant defections from some of the anti-Netanyahu parties, nobody can put together a government, right? So there's a degree of Israel fatigue that's setting in. And you know, look, for the fact of the matter is, and I'm just describing, right? I mean, if you look at all surveys of American Jewish voting, roughly 80% of American Jews are Democrats, right? And it's even a larger percentage since the Orthodox community tends to vote about 50-50. All right, so that means probably 85% of non-Orthodox Jews vote Democratic, right? And, you know, yet over the last 4 years, you had this very open alliance between Bibi and Trump and the evangelicals, right? Again, I'm just describing this, right? And I think this is objectively a turnoff for many American Jews. Now, from my perspective, the fact that we had 4 years with a president that I could not stand did not make me any less of a patriotic American, right? And I do not think you have to support the government of Israel to support Israel, right? But, I have a connection, right? I mean, how many American Jews have a favorite Israeli poet? Right? How many American Jews have a favorite Israeli musician? Right? I mean, I could live in Israel tomorrow and not skip a beat, right? But that's not true of, of most American Jews. And so, this idea, I mean, so there have been a lot of things that have, caused a rupture to some extent between Israel and the American Jewish community. I think I have a lot more material that we're not going to get to tonight, and it is late, but I'll stop here. And again, if there are questions or comments, have at it. Yeah, Sue, and then Alan.
Well, I know I just briefly wanted to say that I agree with you, 600%. I am tired of hearing American Jews that are critical of an aspect of Israel and then kind of take on the persona of, they've had enough of Israel. And I think a lot of us didn't like the politics in America, but we didn't cease loving America. So I don't know why you can't, love Israel, but, disagree with some of the politics.
Well, I agree with you, except that that's very often the message that people hear, right? That is frankly very often the message that people hear, right? And so you can't fault people for believing what they're told, right? And so that's a problem. I mean, I think that the message has to be far more nuanced, right? That it is possible to support Israel, but not support the policies of a particular government of Israel, right? But that's a very
breaking up.
That's a nuanced message.
You're breaking up.
And we don't. Yeah, Alan.
Rabbi, this is a terribly unfair question, but it's getting late. Is there a player in the United States who could help put together, who could shoehorn a majority government that would work in Israel at this point, in your opinion?
I don't think so, because to a large extent, American pressure on Israel is counterproductive, in my opinion. In my opinion, and Israelis do not want to be treated as if they are a vassal state of the United States, right? And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, but to a large extent, I mean, the collapse of the Oslo process is also a collapse of American American influence in the Middle East, I think. you know, and there are, you know, you have, I mean, okay, so the Abraham Accords, so Trump was involved and he claimed some credit and probably deserves some credit. Not as much as he claimed and not as much as he's being given, right? Because, you know, there's the old adage, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And Iran
Frozen. Frozen my
has
mind.
done more for Arab-Israeli rapprochement than anybody else, right? There's a commonality of interests and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, right? So, you know, but the fact of the matter is that you know, you can legitimately ask the question, how long can this limbo status of the West Bank and Gaza continue, right? And the sort of common wisdom is it can't continue forever. Well, it may not be able to continue forever, but it's continued for 54 years, right? And you know, ever since the construction of the West Bank security barrier, right? Life inside Israel is pretty good. It's pretty good. And you know, look, as much as I am no fan of Netanyahu, um, he's done a good job with the economy. The Israeli economy is thriving. Um, Israel is no longer the pariah state that it was, right? It's not the pariah state in Europe. It's not the pariah state in the Arab world, right? Thus proving maybe that this limbo can continue forever. I don't know. I mean, so I don't know that there's much that the United States can do, you know, short of the kind of pressure that I wouldn't want to see, you know, like what, cut off all military aid to Israel? I mean, nobody supports, no sane person supports that, right? So you know, I personally, I think that America's ability to influence things is more limited than it has been in a long time. But I could be wrong. All right. Anybody else?
Yep.
All
Shabbat
right.
Shalom, Hag Sameach.
Hag Sameach, everybody, and good night.
Good night, thank you.
Hag Sameach. Good night. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.
Hag Sameach.